any way I am not, and certainly not as an authority on the human mind, ditto for that, neither of which I am, but simply as the author of my book. For in my own experience in researching and writing The Lost, it seemed to me that there are, in the transformation, as I put it in the book, of what happened into the story of what happened, two kinds of error to which the historical record is prone. One of these has to do with memory, that is, with the subjectivity of eyewitness accounts. And the other has to do with what I'll call history, which is to say, with the subjectivity of the historian, the person who's recording what happened. To illustrate what I mean by these things, I want now to do what I like to do, which is to tell stories about my family. To tell you two parallel sets of stories, one pair from my childhood and one from the period when I was writing the book, a book that I came to write, indeed, because of a confluence of two more ostensibly disparate things. On the one hand, a pure accident of genetics, of chance resemblances. On the other, a consuming, driven, purposeful obsession. The first of these may itself be said to correspond to the unpredictable and indeed often random way in which memory often functions, and the second to the aware purposefulness behind the impulse to record, to preserve the past for the sake of history. So let me begin with an old story about the unreliability of witnesses. The liar in question, in this case, was my grandfather, a famous liar, or at least a famous storyteller, which may be the same thing. When I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, I had this fabulous grandfather, dashing, funny, a man whom people would describe as a snappy dresser, whose argyle socks always matched his trousers, a man who was so lavish that he carried not one but two wallets. One in his trouser pocket for money and credit cards, and the other a mysteriously elongated thing whose contents we never saw, carefully placed in his breast pocket of whatever sports coat he happened to be wearing. A man who had come to this country as a youth of 18 in the year 1920 and made good. A man who spoke 7 languages and had 4 wives and 1 child, my mother. Oh, A.B., people would say, the stories he tells, the jokes. And indeed, the jokes were good. One crowded Thanksgiving, he made my poor great-aunt Ida, his sister-in-law, pee in her pants before she could get away from the table. I preferred the stories to the jokes. I would sit at his feet when he came to visit us from Florida, and he would languidly but cannily spin his famous tales of life in his little town, his staple, about the Ukrainian woodcutter, the Goy, who was so afraid on Yom Kippur that he'd come down from the hills to stay with a Jewish family that one night each year, because on that one night he was afraid of the Jewish God. About the little individual challah breads that his family's maid, Yoika, would bake each Friday for him and his 6 siblings. About his sister who died a week before her wedding. About the teenage Russian POWs from whom he learned Russian during World War I, while he, also a teenager, sat guarding them. Well, okay, playing cards with them. But the one story my grandfather would never tell was about his older brother, Uncle Shmuel, whose death we knew was the devastating tragedy of his life. Uncle Shmuel, the handsome one, the macher, the prince of the family, who had stayed behind in Poland after his other siblings emigrated to New York, and who in time was, this was the only thing Grandpa ever did say, killed by the Nazis. Even as a child, I was struck by the strange imbalance in our family narrative, the profusion of colorful stories about trivial things, the death of any story whatsoever about this great thing, this tragedy, which we knew even as children was part of a larger global tragedy. But on that one subject, my grandpa remained uncharacteristically silent, and of this mysterious Shmuel, we only knew his face from some photos, my favorite of which was an ancient World War I studio portrait featuring Shmuel, then only 19 years old, seated next to some unknown and unknowable comrade against a painted backdrop in uniform. And the only detail we ever heard in the years before my grandfather died in 1980, or I should say overheard, during a late-night conversation he had with my mother, on which I shamelessly listened in, was that Schmiel and his family had been hiding in some kind of castle, presumably the manor of the local Polish landlord, and that the hiding place was betrayed and they were all killed. Many years later, I would spend a great deal of time traipsing around Ukraine looking for this particular castle. A castle, I heard my grandfather say that night, the night of the one detail. I can still hear his accent. I knew it well, and I knew how to interpret it well, too. All those years in which he told so many stories except that one, we never really wondered why he had been silent. On the one hand, the horror of what had happened was too great to bear. On the other, there had never been any real story to tell. As I've said, the only detail to escape from the annihilation of Bolokhof was that odd little factoid about the Kessel, and who knew what to make of that? So my grandfather was silent, and we never bothered to wonder why. Then my grandfather died, or I should say in the interest of the truth, he killed himself after a lifetime of what was then called nerves, of breakdowns, mental anguish nobody could get to the bottom of. He died on a Friday the 13th in June of 1980, and my mother and I flew to Miami to settle his affairs. And it was during the course of this mournful process that we finally got to see what was in that other wallet, the elongated one that didn't contain cash or credit cards, which tumbled off a desk that summer day onto my lap as I packed up his papers. And what was in that wallet was this: a bunch of yellowed letters, all dated 1939, in a sloping German hand. Letters written by Uncle Schmiel to my grandfather, begging for help to get out of Europe as the world shut down around him. Letters, the replies to which vanished 70 years ago, and whose contents can never be known, except of course for this, that whatever it was my grandfather wrote back, whatever it was he did or did not do in response to his brother's pleas, made my grandfather so guilty that he carried his guilt with him for the rest of his life, a life that he finally decided to end. So that was the reason why Grandpa never said anything, and perhaps the reason that he jumped in the swimming pool that night. He was guilty. That's how little we had known all those years. That's how unreliable that great storyteller was. The day I sat on the floor of his empty apartment in 1980 was the day I learned that the actors in crucial events, though they are important sources, always have agendas, can always be hiding things or protecting someone or themselves, or covering up sins of their own and others. I want to linger in these childhood years to describe another way in which the past can become lost between history and memory, which itself seems subject to two opposing forces: the random chance of what we happen to recall or preserve in our minds for whatever reasons, on the one hand, and much more trickily, the willed, subjective desire to present certain things but repress others. In those days, when I was little and still regularly attending family gatherings that included people who had been born the subjects of the Emperor Franz Joseph, people who had been lucky enough to leave Bolokhof before the war, for the most part, many of those people cried whenever I entered the room. So great was my resemblance, they said, to Uncle Schmiel at my age. Of those people, no one wanted to weep and hug me more than the man we knew as Herman the barber. Now, as much as my interest in Schmiel had already been piqued by that time, and how not, given the reaction I provoked, the tears that would set me on the path to righting the loss, this Herman was someone I avoided, someone off-putting, even irritating. He was old and deaf and rattled on in a Yiddish that I didn't understand whenever he tried to get near me, which was often. He just seemed a particularly unappealing part of the mass of elderly people who used to descend on us at holidays. And at these occasions, I would purposefully ignore Herman the barber, until a few years later, he no longer showed up anymore, and I didn't have to worry about him ever again. Only years later did I understand the enormity of my error. When I was in the 10th grade, I had to prepare a report about World War I, which we were then studying in social studies. And so I asked my mother to let me bring in that old World War I studio portrait to school. This she didn't like to do, and indeed she had long ago made mimeograph copies of the photos, which I was allowed to peruse for the purpose of my genealogical studies. The point of this aside is that I had a good visual memory of the front of each photo. Schmiel, for instance, in his uniform, that other strange and unknown soldier behind him, but not of the back, on which, as I recalled from my one early handling of the photo itself before my mother sealed it away, my grandfather had written something like, "Uncle Schmiel killed by the Nazis in the Austrian army, 1916. But when my mother carefully excavated the precious photo that day in 1975, when I was working on my social studies project, and reliberated the photo from its Tutankhamun-like nests of baggies and shoeboxes, I saw that I had made the first of what would be many mistakes in my search for Uncle Schmiel. For as I could now see clearly, what my grandfather had actually written on the back of the photo, the original of which I finally was holding in my hands, was this: Uncle Schmiel, killed by the Nazis in the Austrian army in 1916 with his best friend Herman the Barber. And so, from the very beginning of my own inquiry into Holocaust history, there were problems with history and memory, problems posed by self-interested narratives, and more subtly, but perhaps more troublingly, self-deluded narrators. When, as an adult, I resumed my search for Uncle Schmiel, I would run into these two kinds of problems once more. The first story is about unreliable witnesses once more. At a certain point in my researches, my search for those who had known my relatives took me to Sydney, where in fact 5 Bologov Jewish survivors had emigrated separately after the war. I have to interrupt here. You think you know how things happen. This is a great problem of real historians. You're always projecting your own thinking onto the past. So when I found out that there were 5 Jewish survivors from my town living within 3 miles of each other in Sydney, I said, well, obviously they emigrated together after the war. And the guy I was talking to said, oh, he said, I was in a supermarket in Sydney in 1952, when who should I run into in the produce department but my neighbor from Bologov? And he said, I said, really? He said, yeah, we all came here separately. We had no idea. So it just goes to show you. It's not like 5 people from LA ending up in New York, okay? Among the people that I spoke to in Sydney was one I was particularly interested in, a woman called Meg Grossbard, who, we have been told, was the best high school girlfriend of Fridka, Schmiel's second daughter. For this reason, I was very eager to interview her, but she was very prickly, very difficult, this Meg Grossbard. She finally agreed to be videotaped by me on the condition that she would talk only about my family, the Jaegers, but refused to talk about herself or her family or how she had survived the war. That was fine with me. And she had much to say about my lost relatives and their lives in the 1920s and 1930s, the winter nights crocheting and playing canasta, the ski trips, the basketball games, many other things. Among the precious facts that she transmitted was one that slipped out accidentally, a name, a single name, Chisko Szymański, who, as we later learned, was a Polish Catholic boy who had tried to hide Fridka, and perhaps Schmiel as well, in some Polish person's house, but someone betrayed them. Hiding, a house, betrayal. So the old story I had accidentally overheard as a child, that night I heard my grandfather talking about the castle, was true after all. When I finished with this Mrs. Grossbard in Sydney, she suggested that we go to Stockholm, the first in a dominoes-like series of travels that took us from Australia to Scandinavia, to Israel, to Lithuania, to Poland, and then back to Israel, back to Scandinavia, to talk to another of Fritke's friends, a woman called Clara Freilich. This we did. We spent a few days in Stockholm and heard much about Fritke, not least the fact that she was pregnant with this Polish Catholic boy's child when she and he were betrayed and taken from the Polish house and shot, and also about Clara Freilich herself, a newlywed at the time the war began, one of the rare Bolokov couples of which both members survived. Mrs. Freilich was able to tell us much about the conditions in Bolokov until fairly late in the German occupation, because she said she and her husband, dead since the 1980s, had been among the last Jews to remain in the town until the final liquidation, from which she said they barely escaped. So we were grateful to her, this tremulous, delicate old lady, pretty and vain, nervous to the point that she didn't want to speak on camera, but instead had prepared a written statement that was at first all that she would say about the war years. She made us homemade gefilte fish the day we visited her in December 2003 in Stockholm. And when we saw that all that there was to drink was vodka, she looked at us and said, "Fish like to swim." 9 months after the trip to Australia, during which we had met Meg Grossbard, and a week after our Stockholm journey, we found ourselves in Kfar Saba, Israel, interviewing another old woman, Clara Heller, who had started life as a girl named Chaya, but who has, since the war, continued to use the name Clara, not a Jewish name, to honor the Polish priest who gave her that name, using it in the false papers that ended up saving her life. When I sat down to interview Clara, who described my long-dead cousin Fritke in her school days to me as a hummingbird flitting from boy to boy, another precious detail rescued from the past, she asked me who else I had been interviewing during my long series of travels, and when I mentioned that we had just seen Mrs. Freilich in Stockholm, she stood stock still in Israel and said, "Don't ever speak to me the name of Freilich." "Why?" I asked, stupefied, remembering Clara's generosity with her stories, her difficult memories, her home cooking, and her vodka. "Because her husband, Yankele Freilich, was in the Yiddische Miliz," she spat, the Jewish police. "How do you think they lasted so long in Bolokov, untouched, when the rest of us were all being killed?" I sat in stunned silence. Clara, I realized, had never actually said what it was her late husband had been doing during the occupation. As she related the hair-raising story of her narrow escape to the forest, she had simply let me assume that what was happening to her was also happening to him. And now I found out that he had been a member of the Jewish police, helping to lead his own people to destruction. She hadn't quite lied, but she hadn't told the truth either. This wrenching revelation was to be repeated, unbelievably, the next day, when I visited another Bolokov survivor, this one in Haifa. Josef Adler, his name is. Josef, too, began our talk by asking me who else I had been talking to, and so I started to retail to him all my travels, starting with Australia earlier that year. When I mentioned the name of the prickly Mrs. Grossbard, he made a sour little face. Noticing this, I laughed. "Yes," I said, "she's a difficult woman. When I got there, she didn't want to cooperate with me at all." This time, Josef Adler laughed out loud. "Cooperate? I doubt it, after what her brother did." "And what did her brother do?" I asked, thinking, not again. "Bumo, her brother," he said, "was a young guy who had a lot of power in the Jewish police, and he took advantage of that, and he did very bad things to people, Jewish people." So I, who should have learned about the unreliability of the witness from my own grandfather, a man who, as I found out too many years after hearing his stories, had a guilty story of his own, had been naive, had been duped again. But then I myself was unreliable, that other problem of historiography. This I finally and concretely understood the next summer during the last of my trips around the world, when I returned to Bologna one last time for, I thought, a few final photographs that would make it into the book. But it was during this trip that quite unexpectedly, accidentally, I finally stumbled across the very house where my great-uncle and his daughter, the hummingbird-like Fritzke Jaeger, had indeed been hiding and had indeed been betrayed and then dragged into an orchard and shot. The house was no castle, I can tell you. But then it was only when I was actually in the house, standing in the basement in a horrible box-like enclosure where my great-uncle and my cousins spent an amount of time that nobody will ever know, that I, anxiously feeling around the tiny little enclosure where they had lived, suddenly realized 40 years later that what my grandfather had said all those years ago on the phone was not castle, Kessel, as he pronounced it, the 50 years of flag-waving, Yankee Doodle singing patriotism, never quite eradicating the plummy Yiddish accent, but Kessel, the Yiddish word for box, which is indeed where they had been hiding. A fact, an essential truth about Schmiel's fate that I had been handed almost 40 years before, but was unable to understand, to make use of, because my ears were the ears of an American grandchild, the grandchild of a man who was a native Yiddish speaker, a man born a subject of the Emperor Franz Joseph, and my brain was the brain of a child who liked the romantic sound of the word castle as a hiding place for his doomed relatives, and who had thus grown up into a journalist who 40 years later would interview dozens of local people